Welcome back to Unpacking Ideas, and thanks for joining if you're new here. Today we're going to be unpacking To Have or To Be by Erich Fromm. Helping me unpack this book today was Oriane Hakkila. Oriane is a fellow member of the New York City philosophy readers community and a longtime reader and practitioner of Fromm's work. In our conversation today, we talked about a lot of stuff. We got into Fromm's analysis of the problems of modernity, the having mode of existence versus the being mode. We talked about the ego, status, hoarding, private property, Freud's anal retentive character, capitalism's effect on society, and then at the end of our conversation, we talked about Fromm's solutions. I don't think it's too strong to say that this is one of those frameworks where after you become aware of it, you never look at the world quite in the same way ever again. So my hope is that our conversation will at least have a sliver of that impact on you, or at least convince you to go and read the book for yourself. So let's get into it. Here it is, my conversation with Oriane on To Have or To Be. All right, welcome.
Hi, Zach. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited. So you've already been up since, I think, what you said, 5 a.m.?
I have. I'm a morning person. I partly walked here from Long Island City, so.
That's great. I wish I was a morning person because, yeah, I think by the time you saw me, you'd had already, walked halfway across the city and, had a
Called
dumpling.
my mom and had dumplings.
Oh my gosh. And I was just brushing my teeth and trying to get my brain to turn on. But yeah, so we've known each other for about a year now?
Yeah, I think over a year. I was trying to also put my finger in. I think I did my first philosophy meetup January 2025. So it's
okay.
May now.
Yeah, I think that's about when I started
half.
hosting. Yeah, and we've done a bunch of books together. I think we did Martin Buber, I and Thou. Nietzsche. We did some Rollo May.
Yeah, we did Rollo May.
So we've talked about a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And we were kind of whispering in my ear, Fromm, let's do Fromm.
Yes.
And this book, you were saying, had a pretty big impression on you.
Yes, it did. Especially at the time I happened to read it. It had a lot of both personal impact and then also philosophical impact. After reading this, I bought like 6 other of his books. And also it sort of guided my personal reading trajectory in a lot of ways. There were a lot of things he sort of brought up, and I wanted to know about them sort of from different perspectives or from different modes of analysis. But yes, this book has been really influential. I both find To Have or To Be incredibly prescient. I think a lot of it diagnostically seemed very relevant to what I have also sort of identified from my own experience about what I see as some directionality or problems in society. But also on a personal level, I found this framework of being versus having to be a very useful personal framework for my own choices and own personal growth.
Yeah, you're right. It does kind of hit on both individual application and societal application.
Yeah.
Well, let's start going through, what Fromm believes are kind of the problems of modern society. This is kind of where he starts the book, his introduction.
I love this framework. He opens the book with this introduction, which is basically saying that the problem we find ourselves in this modern day is the result of, he calls it, the end of an illusion. And the illusion that has ended is the great promise of unlimited progress, all in capital letters, every single word is capitalized individually. And specifically, he says that this great promise of unlimited progress is the promise of domination of nature, of material abundance, of the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and of unimpeded personal freedom. And he says furthermore that this great promise is that which has sustained the hopes and faith of the generation since the beginning of the industrial age.
And so specifically, he lists a couple of the problems that, this idea of kind of domination causes. the biggest, and maybe, just to start here, is the risk of like an existential threat, the risk that we will destroy ourselves as a species and destroy all life on the planet. And, this book was written in 76 or published in 76. So still very much during the Cold War. I think that was probably, weighing heavy on his mind. And he also mentions, the risk of kind of environmental collapse as well. He says, technical progress itself has created ecological dangers and the dangers of nuclear war, either of both of which may put an end to all civilization and possibly to all of life. And to foreshadow a little bit, we're going to kind of be talking about like this having mode of being and this being mode of being. But there's a little play on words at the end where he's saying it's actually not a matter of to have or to be. It's more a matter of like to be or not to be, to quote Shakespeare, in the sense of like, if we don't kind of figure out how to be in this being mode of existence, we may cease to be as a species. So I enjoyed the wordplay there, but it's also a pretty strong, message right on top to, definitely gets our attention.
Yeah, definitely. And then sort of the second problem, he says, generally, we're sort of summarizing. He says lots of little things that we're combining, but he also says that people are just unhappy, that in general, our modern society has led to large groups of people who are unhappy, alienated, lonely, depressed, destructive, dependent. On page 5, he says that, but even without theoretical analysis, the observable data show most clearly that our kind of pursuit of happiness does not produce well-being. We are a society of notoriously unhappy people, lonely, anxious, depressed, destructive, dependent, people who are glad when we have killed the time we are trying so hard to save.
Yikes.
I love, he has some zingers.
Yeah.
Like his sentences pack a punch.
I think we covered that one well. I think the third is more of a critique of the myth of progress on society. Mm-hmm. And how I understood this idea is basically, in a capitalist society or in a having mode society, and we'll kind of draw distinctions between those two in a little bit here, but what is best for the individual is not necessarily what is best for the system. And so there's an emphasis towards things like egotism, selfishness, competition, because that is best for the system. And so I think he's saying we've kind of bought into this myth that that is also what is best for society and best for the individual. And I found the quote too where he talks about, this is on page 6, he says, the development of this economic system was no longer determined by the question what is good for man, but by the question what is good for the growth of the system.
Yes, yeah.
One tried to hide the sharpness of this conflict by making the assumption that what was good for the growth of the system, or even for a single big corporation, was also good for the people.
And then the following sentence, this construction was bolstered by an auxiliary construction, that the very qualities that the system required of human beings, egotism, selfishness, and greed, were innate in human nature. Hence, not only the system, but human nature itself fostered them.
Right.
So I think one of the points I also drew that he's making is that part of the reason this may be so hard to address, either on an individual or societal level, is because this has effectively been rendered invisible. If we already presume that humans are all selfish, and if we already presume that well-being is to be found in material acquisition, then there is no way to even question the logic of a system which asks people to behave selfishly or for the purpose of material acquisition. Like you don't question the logic of consumption if the presumption is, well, consumption makes you happy and everyone has a right to consume, and that is what freedom is. Right.
Yeah, well said. I think we're probably good to keep going. Let's go on to talking about, having or being, which is, what this book is called. People are probably like, when are they going to get
the
to
book
it?
is called
What is it? Yeah.
To Have or To Be.
But I think we did kind of need to lay some of this framework before we get into it. So he talks about the having mode and the being mode of these two kind of modes of existence, these two kind of ways of going about
character orientations.
Character orientations, yeah. Go for it.
Oh, I was just going to say, we had discussed beginning how he begins, which is actually, I think, sort of wonderful, which is sometimes things are easier to see through example than necessarily having it defined. And so that's what he does in the book. He just opens with a bunch of examples of the difference between having and being. And I'm not sure if you want to start with the poetry, because that is how he opens.
Let's do it. Yeah, I think that's a great point. In that, once we start kind of giving some examples of the having versus being mode, I think it'll become kind of clear what he's getting at. So in the kind of poetic expressions of this, he has these two different poems. The having mode of being is expressed by this poem by Tennyson. This is the poem. He says, "Flower in a cranied wall, I pluck you out of the crannies. I hold you here, root and all in my hand, little flower. But if I could understand what you are, root and all in all, I should know what God and man is."
And then in comparison, he gives a Japanese poem by Basho. It's a haiku, which is, "When I look carefully, I see the Nazuna blooming by the hedge."
And that's it.
That's it.
So he says, Tennyson reacts to the flower by wanting to have it. He plucks it root and all. And then he says, Bashu's reaction to the flower is entirely different. He does not want to pluck it. He does not even touch it. All he does is look carefully to see it. And then later he says, Tennyson appears to need to possess the flower in order to understand people and nature. By his having it, the flower is destroyed. What Bashu wants is to see, not only to look at the flower, but to be at one, to quote, one himself with it and to let it live.
Which is, I think, a beautiful introduction to this distinction between being and having. One, Tennyson's framework, sort of the framework of the West, as is sort of the central argument to this book, is this mode of having, that enjoyment or relation or existence in the world is one of possession. It's one of seeing the world as divided up into these atomistic objects that one seeks to acquire. And it's only in the acquisition, in the possession, that meaning or experience is found. Whereas in contrast, the being mode, as described in the Basho poem, is instead this is sort of like, to go, we both read Buber together, this idea of sort of like relational vow. It's not like the things out in the world are objects for me to go have or possess or own, that they're just things that by being in relation to them, by being, I appreciate and I experience and I am open to. And I sort of see that as sort of like the core of this distinction between to have and to be.
Yeah, this is such a great example up top. It makes me think, I mean, personally, I remember going camping when I was a little kid with my dad. I was probably, 6 or 7 at the time, like pretty young. And we came across all these salamanders in a creek bed. And at the time I was like, I want these as pets. Like I want to keep them. And my dad obliged, which I'm sure I was very persuasive or whiny at the time, but like I ended up taking these salamanders back to my house and like putting them in a terrarium, and of course they died in like a month later.
Yeah.
But that need to possess, like it wasn't enough to just kind of enjoy seeing these salamanders in that moment. Like I wanted to have them. I wanted to kind of cling to that experience. So I very much kind of, related to this poem. I like to think I've kind of outgrown that a little bit, which I think we can talk about a little bit later if the having mode is something that we can kind of mature out of. But yeah, I thought this was an excellent kind of, contrast, between the Bashu, who's just happy just to experience that moment, live in the present, and not try to kind of cling to the wanting to possess that flower.
Right. Yeah. It's so funny that you mentioned the salamanders. As soon as you said that, I was like, wow, I did that so much when I was a kid. I think we caught toads that I kept. I remember my dad and I trying to catch chipmunks. We did not succeed.
Oh my God.
But yeah, there was this like idea of like, oh, that's so cute. I want it to be mine. I want to own it.
Right.
I think then he brings in, well, so then to sort of like highlight that, like he ends by saying then, this having mode, this I need to possess, is so deep in orientation that furthermore, it's how we identify ourselves. It's not just this like need to possess. It's that these possessions, in fact, become who we are. So it's more than just, oh, I'm going to like acquire stuff and a commentary on like, well, acquiring stuff is bad. I think his deeper point is that when we are in a mode where we see the world in terms of acquiring stuff, we also begin to see ourself as something that is defined by what we acquire, and even further that we'll discuss in depth later, but that I myself am something then that is just an object, which is defined by the value that someone could place on me.
Yeah.
So he sort of ends this on page 24. He said, modern consumers may identify themselves by the formula, I am is what I have and what I consume.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, because, I guess at a very surface level, it might just seem like this is about, the having mode is about possessing and consuming things in the world. But like you said, it goes further than that to where we get to actually abstract concepts and, wanting to own and possess people, or wanting to own and possess knowledge, or like you said, even things like status, or things that are kind of connected to the ego as well. Maybe we can talk about learning.
Yeah, that's a great example of exactly what you were saying, sort of this application to not just flowers or pets or rocks or something, but to things that we might not think of ourselves as having this subject-object relationship with, where we see it in terms of acquisition. But that Fromm, I think, very persuasively describes how there can be different modes in how we relate to sort of these intangible experiential things.
Right. Well, and so maybe I'll read some of this.
Yeah.
So he's contrasting the having mode of learning and versus the being mode. So in the having mode, he says, students in the having mode of existence will listen to a lecture, hearing the words and understanding their logical structure and their meaning as best as they can. They write down every word in their loose leaf notebooks so that later on they can memorize their notes and thus pass an examination. But the content does not become part of their own individual system of thought, enriching and widening it. Instead, they transform the words they hear into fixed clusters of thought or whole theories which they store up. And then I like this part a lot. He says, students in the having mode have but one aim: to hold on to what they have learned, either by entrusting it firmly into their memories or by carefully guarding their notes. The having type of individual feel rather disturbed by new thoughts or ideas about a subject because it puts into questions the fixed sum of information they have.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I totally get what he's saying here. So when I was in law school, like I feel like so much of the early part of law school and then also studying for the bar exam is literally this like writing down, like, can you transcribe every single word that the professor says? And I guess if I had been a better student in some of those classes, I would have tried to like integrate like what they were saying and have real conversations with the information. But I have to admit, there were classes where I was like, nope, I just really want to get a good grade. I just need to get a good grade on my transcript so I can get a job. And so what you're doing, you're just memorizing. You're just memorizing those like little clusters of information, or for the bar exam, figuring out how it can be deployed. And honestly, if you ask, I don't remember what I learned in some of those classes. It was purely instrumental. It was something that I was acquiring. And then if you even take it further, maybe that explains, this is so famous in law school as well, people who just like refuse to share their notes. They're like, see it as a threat, someone else having their notes, to like their like they're potentially getting like a good grade. It's like this idea like, oh, this is my possession.
Yeah.
Like you're gonna threaten me if I share it, because the point is like the ownership here.
Oh, for sure. Or yeah, I mean, I feel like that's true in any industry, like the kind of trade secrets of like, I can't kind of let my other colleagues know what I'm up to, or like my secrets, because you're viewing them as competition. Yeah, I also thought of like there's a scene in The Matrix where like Neo wants to learn how to drive a helicopter, and they just download the information like right into his brain. So it's a kind of like, I don't know, maybe a desire to that. Like I just want to have all of this information. I don't really want to integrate it. I don't want to really question it.
Yeah.
I just kind of want to download it into my consciousness.
Yeah. Rather than the being mode, which would be in the learning sense, the integrating, and same with knowledge. Knowledge is, I think he says like, in the being mode, there's never this idea that you go in as a tabula rasa. You're never this empty vessel that has like these pebbles. I think that's where he says it.
Yeah, he says, to begin with, they do not go into the course lectures, even to the first one, as a tabula rasa. They have thought beforehand about the problems the lectures will be dealing with and have in mind certain questions and problems of their own. What they listen to stimulates their own thinking process. Which I was a little surprised to hear. I was thinking when he was going to get to the being mode that he was going to say, kind of like a beginner's mind type of idea of kind of, empty your cup and go into the lecture as a kind of empty vessel to learn without, prior judgments. But I see where he's going with this. I think he's just, talking about critical thinking and kind of integrating whatever you're learning with your existing knowledge. I think some of this too is the difference between a kind of passive type of existence and an active type of existence. Whereas a passive thing, if you are just like Neo getting, information planted in your brain, you're not actually doing anything. Whereas if you're really contending and, really contending with the ideas, you are very actively kind of involved in the learning process.
I agree. I think that's a really important point you highlighted. I think that he's also drawing in this distinction between having and being, the difference between passivity and activity. That being is always necessarily an active mode.
Yep. Well, let's talk about a few of these other examples. Conversing.
Oh, I loved this example. So he uses two sort of having mode examples for conversing. For the first one, he says, like when you get into an argument with someone. So he says, let us take a typical conversational debate between two men in which A has opinion X and B has opinion Y. Each identifies with his own opinion. What matters to each is to find better, i.e. more reasonable, arguments to defend his own opinion. Neither expects to actually change his opinion, or that his opponent's opinion will change either. Right. Each is actually afraid of changing his own opinion, precisely because it is one of his possessions, and hence its loss would mean an impoverishment. So this idea that, like, even when you're entering a conversation, if you are in the having mode, those thoughts and opinions are these possessions of yours. And so as you were saying with knowledge, there's this existential threat, there's this defensive fear that I can't go in open-minded to change my mind, because then who would I be? Who would I be if I lost my possession?
Yeah.
And so now you have this conversation where it's two people who are like theoretically in an argument, but neither of them actually intends to listen to the other person or have their mind changed. Or actually learn anything.
100%. Which is, that's most debates.
Is a lot of...
most debates, most conversations.
Yeah.
Well, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Like, he talks about, like, like something like losing an argument or a debate could be seen as like a threat to your status or your ego. But later he also talks about, you like talked about it as an existential threat. And I think it, a lot of times our knowledge and our theories about the world are what orient us. So when we come across different things that challenge that, it can feel really threatening. Like, I have this whole way of understanding the world, and, I kind of put people in these categories or whatever. And then somebody challenges that. It's like they're challenging that very thing that orients you
Yeah.
and kind of gives you some semblance of control in the world.
Yeah, and I think that's what Fromm is getting at. And to be fair, I don't think he says like later, very much later in the book, about how these like frameworks and things are not bad. They're not in themselves bad. In fact, they're inescapable. We're always going to have frameworks. Like
Sure.
it's impossible not to have them. But I think the distinction he's drawing is this like sort of identification of via the vehicle of like, he describes it as this like having, that it's not just using a framework, because if you're using the framework, then the framework is sort of flexible and it can shift. You can be in conversation with it. You can learn in your lecture course something new, and you can be like, ooh, my current framework doesn't allow for that, so maybe I should like reconsider or shift my framework or make it flexible. Whereas the distinction with the having of the framework is exactly that rigidity. I've put the world into boxes. I've put myself into a box. Like who am I without my little boxes, or without my little store of pebbles?
Right. I love that kind of who am I too, because I think, even it can be something like a title where it's like I view myself as a doctor, right? And then it's like, well, what happens when you retire, right? You can have that kind of existential crisis. Well, and then should we talk about the being mode of conversation as well?
Yeah, if you want to go ahead.
He says, in contrast to the being mode, he says, are those who approach a situation by preparing nothing in advance, by bolstering themselves up in any way. Instead, they spontaneously and productively. They forget about themselves, about the knowledge, the positions they have. Their egos do not stand in their own way, and it is precisely for this reason that they fully respond to the other person and the person's ideas. They give birth to new ideas because they are not holding on to anything and can thus produce and give.
Yeah, and then the following sentence, while the having persons rely on what they have, the being persons rely on the fact that they are, not what they are, but the fact that they are, that they are alive, and that something new will be born if only they have the courage to let go and to respond. And that, again, that sentence, that whole paragraph reminded me a lot of Martin Buber and like this idea of I and thou. You can either see the world and conversation and interaction as an I and it. It's a me and another thing. And the thing is a thing because I've already decided what its qualities are and what its framework is. And I've already decided to look at the tree in terms of its colors. I've already decided to look at the person in terms of how attractive I find them. Or you can approach them as a thou, by being open to it. Exactly like he's saying. You can be open and not trying to decide that the world has to fit into your framework, your pre-existing framework.
Yeah. It's like I like another kind of example of like the active versus the passive. In that way, in the being, it's very active. You're kind of spontaneously responding to the moment versus kind of, trying to essentially perform.
Yeah,
right?
It is perform. Yeah, and that's
the having
actually,
mode, right?
That's the second example he gives of the having mode in conversing. He said you can either, one example of the having mode of conversing is you have these combative arguments where everyone comes in with predetermined ideas. And he says the second mode of having and conversing is you go in because you sort of like want something from the relation, like from the conversation. You want, and not in a bad way necessarily, but like not like you want something like they have to give you something, but in the sense that you want praise, or you want to be liked, or you want the conversation to go a certain direction, or you want to be thought of in a certain way, or you want to make a good impression. And because of that, in contrast to this like being open and letting it flow and being like constantly attentive to the other person, you pre-prepare all these like he described, I sort of imagined it as like you like lay this blanket out where you put like all the goods on the table, where you're like, look how pretty I am, look how smart I am, look what school I went to, like look at my job, like love me. But you've already decided beforehand that that's where the conversation will go. You're not actually listening to the other person. You're just trying to show your wares. Yeah.
I think the most kind of insidious version of this I can think of is the kind of pickup arts community where it's like, you're actually like memorizing some kind of story or routine that's like supposed to like make you look good to the other person, right? Because you already have that end goal of like, I want to sleep with the other person or whatever. So it's the antithesis of the being mode in that you have a fixed agenda and you're passively kind of regurgitating something that you've planned ahead of time in this kind of, again, performance.
Yeah. Though when you think about it, I mean, I guess we haven't talked that much yet about the relationship between this having mode and egotism. But when you sort of think about it, that's sort of like so much of what he's saying is the having mode. Like when we're talking about the arguments, like, well, why do you care so much about sticking with your opinion? Well, because it's part of your ego. It's part of your identity. Why do you care so much about having that car or that degree? Because it's part of your ego. It's part of your identity.
Yep.
And so the having mode, he says, is sort of inextricably tied with identity as egotism.
And the other thing that maybe this is a little bit out of order of what we were thinking of, but I think it relates here is, I think some people might be asking, and I was definitely asking at this point in the book, like, well, don't we need things? Like we need to have things, right, in order to exist. Like this maybe sounds a little too idealistic, and he does address that. He talks about this in terms of existential having versus characterological having. Maybe we'll read a little bit about this, but I think this ties into the ego thing, because I think what he talks about
I agree.
in terms of characterological having, which is the kind of having he wants to get rid of, is more tied to this ego having. So he says, existential having for human existence requires that we have, keep, take care of, and use certain things in order to survive. This holds true for our bodies, for food, shelter, clothing, and for the tools necessary to produce our needs. And then he says, characterological having we have been dealing with so far, which is the passionate drive to retain and keep, that is not innate, but that has developed as the result of the impact of social conditions on the human species as it is biologically given. And then he says, existential having is not in conflict with being, characterological having necessarily is.
So this idea really related or reminded me of in Vedic philosophy, sort of like the 8-legged path. There are these lists of like do's and don't do's. And one of them is don't steal. And sort of in a Western property having centered mode, we think, oh, don't steal, like don't like go shoplift or something. But what that prohibition actually is talking about is don't take more than you need, don't hoard. So it's the idea that like, oh, you need however much to eat. If you're going to go help yourself to an extra large portion at the buffet and you know you're not going to eat it all, you're stealing, because you're stealing from the earth. You're stealing from people who could be using that. You're going to go buy yourself more clothes. Do you have already clothes to wear? Like, why are you actually buying it? If you don't need it, it's theft. It is theft from the resources of the world. It's theft of people's labor. It's theft in that sense. And that, to me, really resonated with this distinction between what does he mean by existential having?
Yeah. No, I like that you brought up hoarding, because I think that's a great example as well. Like, when you think of, I don't know, even like the show Hoarders, right? Oh, yeah. It's like
crazy show.
Yeah, it's a great show, but it's pretty clear to most people who are not hoarders watching that show that this is a pathological form of having and clinging, right? But I think to the people who are hoarders and have, this house they can't even move in, they have this feeling that like, oh, no, I might need that thing. I might need that empty Pringles can at some point. So I think this is where it can get a little bit blurry where exactly this line is drawn, because, even we talked about ego and status. I mean, I would argue status can relate to existential having in some sense. Like, we do need some form of status in order to, have our jobs and our careers. When I was thinking about this, I was kind of thinking about, we read a book called The Meaning of Anxiety by Rollo May, and he talks about what he calls normal anxiety versus neurotic anxiety. And the distinction he has is basically like normal anxiety is like useful. And I think he's talking about the individual, but it's useful to you. Whereas neurotic anxiety, something like obsessive compulsive disorder, right? It starts to actually not become useful. It's actually interfering with your life rather than helping you. I wonder if this similar thing exists here around this kind of existential and characterological having, where it's like a healthy desire for status maybe would be existential, right? Just to not get fired from your job, versus something where it becomes more pathological. I don't know. Wondered what you think of that idea.
I guess I don't really agree with that distinction for two reasons. First, I think, at least the way I read the being mode, is part of it is this entire movement away from that we can make determinations on the external appearance of things, which means that this idea that like we from the outside could draw anyone's bright line of like, is this being or is this having, is sort of an impossibility. Like only you yourself would know if what you're doing is in the being or the having mode. I do think, like, at least for me personally, I think as I've done a lot more inner work, I can sort of like discern sort of what I can interpret as people's relationships with certain ideas or beliefs or things in their life. But because so many behaviors can arise, the same behaviors can arise from drastically different positions. Yeah, I think it's got to be, it's an internal orientation. Only you yourself will know if you're in a having or being mode, and only you can be honest with yourself of what that's doing for you and why you're doing it. You could be someone who is going to go get their PhD and they're doing it because they really, really love the topic and they find that the study and the involvement is meaningful to them and that's why they want to do it. On the other hand, someone could go do it because they really think it's important that they can say that they have a PhD or to prove that they've gotten into a PhD program. Only the person who's doing that will know what their orientation is. Maybe someday if they like self-reflect on it.
If I'm understanding you correctly, I think what maybe you're circling is the idea that it's less about the external behavior in the world and more the orientation in that.
Yes, exactly. So, I think that's the point that I'm drawing.
Yeah. Well, while we're talking about hoarding a little bit, he talked about Freud a little bit here.
Oh,
and
yes.
The anal retentive character. So he says, all children, before they reach maturity, go through a phase Freud designated the anal erotic. Freud discovered that this phase often remains dominant during a person's development, and that when it does, it leads to the development of the anal character, i.e. the character of a person whose main energy in life is directed towards having, saving, hoarding money and material things, as well as feelings, gestures, words, energy. It is the character of the stingy individual and usually connected with such other traits as orderliness, punctuality, stubbornness, each to a more than ordinary degree.
Yeah, and he also ties it directly to, he says he reads this Freudian idea that the anal erotic character is supposed to only be sort of a developmental stage, limited to sort of an immature level of development. And the fact that, he says, that Freud criticizes it, Fromm extends that criticism to the bourgeois society of the 19th century, because he says the qualities of the anal character constituted the norm for moral behavior for the entire society, and furthermore were looked upon as the expression of human nature. So he's saying that Freud identified these sort of behaviors of hoarding and obsession and stinginess and saving and all of these things. Freud identified, this is part of the behavioral cluster of an immature child that a child passes through on their way to full emotional maturity. And Fromm is like, well, if we've identified that, shouldn't we be concerned that like all of society seems to believe that this sort of immature behavior is just the norm, and not only is the like moral and social norm, but is considered innate within human nature? It sort of is making this claim that like maybe we as a society are all just like really immature.
It's like we as a society are like constipated 3-year-olds. I think is essentially what he's saying, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because again, like I don't think he's drawing the literalness of, Freud was very kind of literal about the child does not want to kind of get rid of his feces and he's kind of hoarding in that sense. But yeah, I think he is drawing that, like you said, drawing this analogy to our society in that it is kind of a, neurotic kind of like arrested development, essentially.
Yeah, yes.
We have arrested development and we need to kind of develop past it.
Yeah, we should address it and definitely not presume that the qualities that we see in this arrested development are actually implicit in human nature and moreover like the goal of society and the goal of ethical and moral behavior.
Yeah. Okay, there's one other place I'd love to go as it relates to hoarding.
Yeah.
He, earlier in the book, talks about the Old Testament. And he talks about the Hebrews traveling through the desert in Exodus. And, he goes on to talk about Moses and how basically God tells them to only kind of eat the manna that they can eat in that moment and not to hoard. He says the second injunction is one against hoarding, greed, and possessiveness. The people of Israel were enjoined not to save anything till the next morning. Quote, but they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And the other thing I would love to talk about with this story is I think there is a lot of significance to the fact that these were a nomadic people in Exodus, and they were traveling through the desert. So they literally couldn't hoard, right? Like if you've ever been backpacking or lived some kind of nomadic, digital nomad lifestyle, you know that you can't really have a big suitcase. You really can't have a lot of things because you're literally moving every day and everything that you own, you're carrying on your back. I guess I bring this up too when we get into a little bit of the like, well, what caused the having mode? I'm wondering of how much of that is the move from kind of nomadic life to agriculture. Yeah, I'm curious your reflections on the Exodus story or just this
For sure.
concept.
I guess I saw, so Fromm, he has like several books that are completely about his thoughts on various religions. So it's another topic of passion for him. And I think one of the things he's doing in drawing these stories together, including of Exodus, is first to say this idea of that being is something that promotes like wellness, that it is an orientation that is beneficial to people, is not something he's just like making up right now. That if you look at a bunch of different traditions, if you look at a bunch of different authors, a bunch of different philosophers, that a bunch of different people from different traditions with different methodologies have also sort of reached the same conclusion. They've sort of reached this conclusion that like man is better off when he is in the being mode rather than being obsessed with acquisition. And so I think that's one of the reasons he brings up this Exodus story. He says like, if you look at the New Testament, God told the Jewish people...
The Old Testament. Yeah.
The Old Testament, yes. Sorry. Thank you.
No
he told them they were somewhere stationary, and he told them, no, you have to leave. You have to leave and become nomads. I promise it is better for you to leave and become nomads. And one of the ways that he tried to enforce this sort of like betterment by being was, I think, this example of like, giving them what they needed. I will always provide you with food, but don't hoard it. Don't make it into something you can have.
Later, too, in the story of Exodus that we were just talking about, the Hebrews again upset God by worshiping a golden calf.
Yeah.
And because God specifically says, don't turn me into an idol.
Don't turn me into something that you can have.
That you can have, exactly. And they kind of can't resist that. He says, the history of the Exodus moves to a tragic end. The Hebrews cannot bear to live without having. Although they can live without a fixed abode and without food, except that sent by God every day, they cannot live without a visible, present leader.
Yeah, and it's interesting. This is something you had mentioned before this conversation, but I do think it's interesting and maybe worth addressing this idea if Fromm is even admitting how hard it is for even like the chosen people with direct connection to God being given this instruction to be, if they even keep falling into the having mode, like how can he also make the claim that like this having mode is not optimal for human nature? Isn't he saying that like, well, no, even in this scenario where there's like direct intervention by God, people somehow keep falling into the having mode? Wouldn't that actually maybe suggest that the having mode versus the being mode is actually human nature?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that is a question that comes up a lot because I think for Fromm, if I'm understanding him correctly, both the having mode and the being mode are two potentialities that we're kind of born with. So I think he rejects the idea. Well, he definitely rejects the idea that we're kind of born selfish and greedy in a kind of Hobbesian sense. But I think he also rejects the idea that we're just kind of born good and like. I think he sees this as both potentialities, and the society in which we live kind of exacerbates or leads us towards one of the others. And there's a few passages where he kind of states this. Maybe we can read a few quotes here. He says, of having and being, in the vast majority, both possibilities are real, and which of the two becomes dominant and which is repressed depends on environmental factors.
Right. And then part of it, he goes on to say as well, he ties that both to the social structure, and as we'll discuss later, particularly like technological industrialization impacts that. And then I think he also, again, he doesn't really state his psychoanalytic position on this that much, but with reference to that Freud anal character bit that we discussed. And then also he goes on to say this assumption contradicts a widely held psychoanalytic dogma that the environment produces essential changes in personality development in infancy and early childhood, but that after this event, the character is fixed and hardly changed by external events.
Yeah.
And he's saying that that's obviously a factor. Society plays a factor. How you're raised plays a factor. He talks in some parts about how the parent treats the child has a large impact on how the child sees themselves and relates to the world, and that can have an impact on the having or being characteristic. But then he also says, like, in terms of a psychoanalytic or capacity thing, like, you're never fixed. Not only is this not human nature, but even what you start out with in life, maybe because of the society you're born into or the parents you have, you can always change.
Yeah,
you always have the potentiality to shift the orientation by what seems to provide wellness or to make sense.
Yeah, I think so too. I think he's big on the fact that we are kind of malleable. Not just that we can be molded or shaped by the culture, but we have the potential to change. He definitely has an issue with private property, and then again, like how we said, how that relates to how we relate to everything, not just tangible things. And again, I wonder how much that is related to like I've heard other thinkers kind of think that like agriculture was kind of the beginning of the end in terms of where we are today. That's maybe a kind of bleak way to put it, but like he focuses more on the Industrial Revolution. And, I'm wondering why do you think he focuses particularly on the Industrial Revolution?
Well, so first on the agriculture point, and I sort of think this also because there's this other book that I've been reading called The Value of Everything by Mazzucato. I think I got that name right, which is an economics book. But it also sort of traces like the history of capitalism early on. And both that author and Fromm both sort of agree on this point that it wasn't necessarily like agriculture or like fixed societies where this problem started. Because in medieval society, even though you had journeymen and tradesmen and you had people like buying and selling goods, the fixes weren't free market. There wasn't this idea that like somehow consumption would define the value of everything. Instead, prices were seen to be something that needed to be justified by moral demands. And so the church set prices, and there was literally no concept of like an invisible hand, or that that economics followed a natural law system. That was a later invention. That was like the Adam Smith, John Rawls, that era. So prior to that, even with agriculture, you didn't really have this sort of push for consumption or idea that externalized value would measure the true worth of something in the same way. That concept sort of arose, I don't know, because of or in tandem with, but sort of arose at the same time as industrialization.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that really kind of does circle the kind of consumer society, and how that has kind of shaped everything. He even talks about how we kind of view ourselves as commodities to be sold.
That
Do you want to go to that part?
Yeah, I would love for us to discuss that. I think it's such a good terminology and just so biting. Like he didn't even live with social media, and he still came up with this idea.
Yeah, your personal brand, right?
Yeah, the marketing character.
So yeah, he calls this phenomenon the marketing character. It's based on experiencing oneself as a commodity and one's value not as use value, but as exchange value. The living becomes a commodity on the, quote, personality market.
And the principle of evaluation is the same on both the personality and the commodity markets. On the one, personalities are offered for sale. On the other, commodities. Value in both cases is their exchange value, for which use value is a sufficient but not a necessary but not a sufficient condition. So I think he draws, again, back to, and so many ties to that Value of Everything book. But again, this idea that like earlier forms of capitalism were not on exchange value. It wasn't that the value of something was tied to what it could be sold for on the market. It was tied to either you were paid for like how much of a thing you produced, or you paid for the amount of work you did. But it was set. It was sort of like a predetermined thing. And so you could say like, yes, okay, maybe there's still problems with defining value in an external sense based on these qualities of production or use, but it was still like tied to some tangible thing in the world. The transformation to an exchange economy or a market economy was the idea that even a thing no longer had inherent value. It was always going to be changed based on whether it was something somebody wanted. And so I like his drawing this distinction where he says, okay, well, like in a use value economy, someone could be like a tradesman and they could be like, yeah, I'm defining my value on external things, but I know what that value is. I know how useful I am. I know what I can make.
Yeah.
And so there was an identity, an internal identity in that sense, still present. But when we got to this exchange value, people, like commodities, suddenly were just at the whim of the market. You have no idea what it's going to be worth. So you have to be able to make yourself sellable. You have to be like, oh, I need to do whatever I can to get the most in this exchange, to be valued by other people as high as possible.
Right.
And so he said that in relation to that, people just erased themselves. They just made themselves into what he calls this marketing character. So I'm going to show up in any situation in the way that I think that I will get the most value. I will be valued the highest.
Yeah, and I thought that was interesting too, because he kind of talks about this as being relate to our loss of our sense of identity and feeling of alienation, is like we don't kind of know who we are anymore because we're just kind of changing by the whims of what society wants. This is on 128. He says, the identity crisis of modern society is actually the crisis produced by the fact that its members have become selfless instruments whose identity rests upon their participation in the corporations, as a primitive individual's identity rests upon membership in the clan.
Yeah. He says, but since success depends largely on how one sells one's personality, one experiences oneself as a commodity, or rather, simultaneously as the seller and the commodity to be sold. A person is not concerned with his or her life and happiness, but with becoming saleable. The aim of the marketing character is complete adaptation so as to be desirable under all conditions of the personality market. Marketing character personalities do not even have egos, for they constantly change their egos according to the principle, I am as you desire me.
Man, it's pretty bleak. Yeah. I would love to move to some of the solutions.
Yep.
And we thought maybe we'd break this down into, kind of steps for individual change as well as kind of collective social change in terms of how he lays it out. So starting with the individual change, he gives a bunch of insights as what the quote new man will look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of implicit in the whole book as well, he is this idea. Hopefully we've made it clear, but it seems like Fromm's really advocating this being over having.
Yeah. Spoilers.
Spoilers. I think
yeah.
We're of the belief that he wants us to be not to have.
Yep.
And I liked this list. And it's a long list, so I don't think we should read it all out, but I did sort of see some general categories of things as that related to sort of other things I had been reading at the time. A few of the bullet points are sort of related to this idea of like internalized identity or internal locus of control. This idea that like the security, sense of identity, and confidence based on faith in what one is, and acceptance of the fact that nobody with nothing outside oneself gives meaning to life. And I think that actually, I don't know if attachment theory, but to me, I was like, oh, that sounds a lot like secure attachment.
Yeah.
Or internal locus of control. Then he talks about sort of being fully present. I was like, oh, it's mindfulness. Talks about joy from giving and sharing and from love and respect for all things. And I was like, oh, compassion and like intersubjective relation. He then goes into a few that are about praxis. So praxis is this sort of Greek virtue ethics idea of that like the ethical work is in what will bring you to the virtues. And or sort of we were talking about like how Eastern tradition is very focused on it's like the doing, do the doing. And so I sort of read some of these as like he's like being is not like an end state. It's not an outcome. It's not like this goal you'll like eventually get and have. The whole point is like the being is the becoming. It's it's the doing of the things. It's not something you'll be able to like have a certificate for at the end of the day.
Right. Like, yeah, it entails consistent work and commitment. So to be a little bit of a downer here, he does. This is maybe the part that upset me at least initially when I read it the most. Because right after this, he gives this list. He says to suggest what people living in contemporary cybernetic bureaucratic industrialism could do to break through the having mode of existence and to increase the being sector is not within the scope of the book. I was like, not within the scope of the book. Like, what?
Other people in my meetup group said the same thing, but I was like, as someone who like took this as like literally like a how-to guide, I was like, I don't see the problem.
It's got everything you need.
I was like, it has everything you need. I guess what I liked about it in terms of it being concrete is that I don't think there is like a concrete set of steps because everyone's circumstance and where they are at a given point will always be different. Yeah. So that the steps that one person needs to get from the having mode to the being mode and why they happen to be in the having mode and not the being mode might be totally different from someone else's. And especially I have felt that like what Fromm is talking about, which I do think ends up being really important, is to oftentimes to get to the being mode, we first have to just like break down and break out of the having mode. And a lot of that I think sometimes is personal. It's like only you know the reason, or like only you know what your ego is attached to. Only you know what really scares you. Only you know like what forms of certainty are fundamental. in how you organize your life and are keeping you from the being mode. And they might be very different from different people. Someone might be like, oh no, like I have to be in the having mode because I need financial security. I never had it growing up. I need it. And someone else might be totally different. They might be like, oh, I don't worry about money at all, but like I really need this relationship to make myself feel stable. I like always need to be in a relationship or be with someone. And so in that sense, like I actually don't mind his approach, because if it's about breaking it down, it's always going to be a personal task.
That's fair. Yeah. And that he's not going to give us like too concrete of what that might look like, because it's going to vary depending on the specific individual. Well, and let's talk a little bit about the societal change, because this is the whole last chapter.
Yeah. What did you think of the societal suggestions?
I don't know. I'm personally maybe a little more skeptical, maybe a little more cynical than Fromm is. They struck me as a little bit idealistic. I think also, before we get into the analysis of kind of societal change, one thing that we maybe haven't laid out is there's not exactly a one-to-one between like having mode equals capitalism, being mode equals socialism. For Fromm, it's a little bit more nuanced. He, as far as my understanding, is saying a lot of or maybe all of the forms of communism and socialism that have kind of shown up in the world have been having modes kind of in disguise. Is that how you're kind of understanding that too?
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting point he made. So he does quote Marx a lot in the book, and he says that just like we can see this advocation for the being mode in the Bible and in the Christian mystics and in Buddhism, he also says we can see it in Marx. But then he very clearly tries to draw this distinction that, however, while Marx himself was advocating, as Fromm reads him, the being mode, that socialism and communism, as they have existed in the world, are the having mode. And specifically, at least the way I read it, is that he was saying like any system which already presumes that value and meaning and well-being and happiness is to be found in the quantity of material goods you have, is always a having mode. So he says that the Western capitalism focuses on sort of this like the free market, everybody should own as much as they want. But communism as it existed focused on everybody should have the exact same amount. But both of them still just assume that like people's happiness and societal well-being is all dependent on the quantity of stuff people have. They just disagree with how to distribute that quantity and what that quantity should be.
Which is why he says, if you just get rid of classes in a society, it's just going to, basically fall back into the same general problem of you're still kind of orienting around material abundance. He even kind of attacks something like asceticism in the sense that you're still focused on material possession. Like that's still the focus.
Yeah. I read that as well. I thought that whole framing of how in that way capitalism, communism, and asceticism are actually the same, even though they're presented as like, here are the different options. And that, aesthetics, if your whole claim is not like, oh, I'm giving up things because they don't matter to me anymore. If your claim is, in order to be well, you must have nothing, your assumption is still on what you have defines who you are. It's just that the ascetic says you must be defined by zero, and the communist says you must be defined by having exactly the same as everybody else, and the capitalist says you must be defined by having as much as possible. It
reminds me of the term spiritual capitalism that gets brought up sometimes, where it's like, you're kind of like virtues. You can kind of virtue signal of like, look how few possessions I have. Look how minimalist I am. So you're kind of,
it's still ego bound.
You're still clinging to the kind of status of it. Okay, but let's go through some of these.
Yeah. So I will say I don't know if I like agree with all of his frameworks, but I thought that it's really unusual for philosophers to give like really concrete, like pragmatic solutions. So I thought that was very brave of him.
Yeah.
And then second, I thought even if his solutions weren't exactly correct, I often thought the diagnoses he had in this chapter was just like so remarkably on point. He talks about on page 154 and 155 a radical change where we should have like sane consumption. And in relation to talking about that is he says like, oh, we can have like government regulatory bodies like step in to limit sort of like what's sold and whether things that are sold are actually good for us or not. And I just thought that was so striking because I feel like you see it a lot right now in the difference between sort of like food regulation laws in Europe and the US, that it is true. If you don't have any sort of regulation, you can end up having everything on the market and you have no idea what's in it and no idea if it's good for you.
Yeah.
And so I was like, at least for that one, I was like, that I feel like we can actually see examples of this, how like there can be limitation on the production of things, which counters our sort of American presumption that having more choices in the consumer market is better for us.
Yeah, I was even thinking like I listened to a podcast. It was like the president of the Environmental Working Group. Like they rate all of these cosmetic items and basically show you like what's in them, and then they give it like a rating based on their own like health and safety standards. And the guy was saying, which actually relates to another point that he brings up, is that, you know, it used to be, he's like, we used to basically, if we found that a company was using something that was like toxic, we would try to kind of knock it off at the legislation, at the legal level, and you know, go to the government about it. And he's like, now we just post about it on social media, and then consumers will then demand that, you know, like they'll stop buying the product because it's been exposed what's in it. So I thought that was interesting because that also lines up with one of his other tactics, which is the power of kind of consumer strikes when it comes to, you know, basically kind of voting with your dollar. And I don't know. I mean, this was written in the 70s. I feel like that has been more of a thing.
Yeah.
Now
there was that Target strike, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Like a big Target strike.
There's been a few Amazon ones, more or less successful, but like where, they're coordinated by the consumer in order to like, you know, get some kind of change to happen.
I liked the one, or at least thought the diagnosis again was interesting on sort of like brainwashing advertisements. Particularly because I was like, he hasn't even seen algorithms. He hasn't even seen like A/B tested direct to consumer, like individualized ads.
He doesn't know what's coming. Yeah. He says all brainwashing methods in industrial and political advertising must be prohibited.
Yeah.
This is one where I was very skeptical of because I was like, well, what does non-brainwashing advertising even look like? Like, I feel like all kind of advertising is brainwashing.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a few things in there, not to go too long on this particular one, to unpack. First, I think there's this, like in this book by Martel, it's called Art in the Age of Artifice. He makes a distinction between art and artifice, and art is expression aimed at like information, basically like you're trying to express and experience something true. So that would be like informational sharing. And artifice is trying to use an output to manipulate people to get a certain end result.
Yeah. And
so like advertisements and pornography are sort of like fundamental artifice because for both of them, the goal is to get people, as many people as possible across as many demographics as possible, to have the exact same reaction, which pornography is like lust, and advertising is desire for that thing. And and another one is propaganda, usually to make you dislike something. And so in that sense, I'm like, I get it. You can draw distinctions between sort of like informational sharing and manipulative advertisements. And then secondarily, the US has so few legally advertising restrictions, but in other countries, like you can't advertise pharmaceuticals. Lawyers can't advertise. You're not allowed to because it's considered manipulative.
Right.
There's limitations in other countries on advertisements to children.
Yeah.
So things like that. So I do think like it might, on one hand, at first blush, sound sort of like crazy or over controlling. On the other hand, there are instances where it actually is in place. And I do think it makes a difference. And that in the US, again, it's like this invisible thing because we so assume that that corporations, A, will act this way, and B, everyone should sort of get the right to try to sell anything in whatever way they can manage to sell it.
Right. When I guess there are some, there are some restrictions against advertising to children. And, then there's also certain laws where it's like, on cigarette containers, you have to include certain things that didn't used to be the case. But yeah, I think Fromm would probably want more regulation, right? You want to talk a little bit about the UBI?
Sure. I mean, would you like to?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, let's see. He says, many of the evils of present-day capitalism and communist societies would disappear with the introduction of a guaranteed yearly income. And he goes on to basically say, that basically humans have a right to live without working. And he also says, we basically already have a welfare system that humiliates people, it controls and humiliates them. He says, but a guaranteed income would require no proof or need for any person to get a simple room and a minimum of food.
Yeah, I love this. I had forgotten that this is where the line came from. I was just telling my roommate about this. I like the line he says, this right expresses a new concept for today, though a very old norm demanded by Christianity and practiced many primitive tribes, that human beings have an unconditional right to live regardless of whether they do their duty to society. And then I love this line. I was like, oh my God, it's so true. It is a right we guarantee to our pets, but not to our fellow human beings.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's exactly.
I don't ask my cat to contribute to the household.
Yeah. What are you doing for me? Yeah, totally. Yeah, and a lot of our pets are living pretty cushy lives these days, eating that premium dog food.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, really interesting, especially UBI has been brought up by a few politicians in the last couple decades, but I think it's being taken a lot more seriously these days, especially depending on how this AI stuff kind of pans out in terms of, if we do have, 30-40% of the workforce unemployed, we're going to need something like this. It's just going to be untenable.
And I agree with, so on 166, sort of the last paragraph of this discussion of UBI, which also I just saw the footnote. He said he first proposed this in 1955. Yeah.
All right.
So, but he talks about how, he says, considering the present day cost of running a large welfare bureaucracy, the cost of treating physical, especially psychosomatic illnesses, criminality, and drug addiction, it seems likely that the cost of providing any person who wanted with a guaranteed annual income would be less than half that of our present system of social welfare. Gabor Mate says the same thing. I think that book came out 5 years ago, at most 10 years ago. And there's a lot of data showing that again, there are all these reports of increasing rates of anxiety, depression, addiction, which are all a giant cost to society. It's cost of lost work. It's cost of familial disruption. It's cost of generational trends. An addicted parent can't be there for their kids, which then has long-term ramifications on education, on all these things. And at least the reports that I've seen, and mostly covered in this Gabor Mate book, are that it would actually be both the costs that society is adding by sort of these,
it would save tax dollars essentially.
Yeah, it would actually the ills that society are creating by this mode, but also if we just were to provide these basic necessities, it actually may be cheaper.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really interesting. I hadn't heard that, but I think that's a argument that maybe a lot of people who would be at least adverse to that kind of a claim would be more receptive to, of your taxes are actually going to go down if we institute something like that. Because I think that is usually the knee-jerk response to something like UBI. Do we want to cover a couple more of these? He talks about women's liberation.
Yeah, I liked this. We didn't really get into it much in this discussion, but he's pretty throughout this whole book. Points to sort of like power disparities and colonialism and class division and wage gaps between countries, all sort of as ills he sees being sort of related to the having mode, and ones that are harmful to society overall, and that also could potentially be addressed by sort of a transformation to the being mode. And so here he says, if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, yeah, so he talks a little bit about agriculture here. He says the domination of women by men began only about 6,000 years ago in various parts of the world when surplus in agriculture permitted the hiring and exploitation of workers, the organization of armies, and the building of powerful city-states. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I guess, again, maybe this is a little bit, again, of my kind of critique of this section, is some of these kind of solutions for the new society are kind of the end goals rather than the ways to get there.
Yeah.
So, you know what I mean? So it's kind of something like, all right, like end, patriarchy. Like, okay, well, what does that look like in order to get there?
And to give him credit, I both think that's true. I think this is sort of, it's also for people listening's context, like for philosophy books, this is so short. It's like 175 pages.
The book, the entire book.
The entire book is 175 pages. And he has so many other books. So he has like an entire book called The Sane Society, which is on society, ways to reform society.
Okay.
He has Man for Himself, which is an entire ethics book. He has The Art of Being, The Art of Listening, The Art of Loving.
At this point in his career, it's just like, God damn it, I wrote a whole book on this. Like, just read my other book. I don't want to write it again here.
I think that's how I read it a lot of times. So I still agree with your critique that as far as a section standing alone without his other resources, I think some of the solutions both seem sort of idealistic, with especially the benefit of hindsight. Sure. And then also like it's just too sparse. It's like too minimal to go through in one page and be like, solve the patriarchy.
Right. Go forth. Yeah. Go forth. Well, yeah. And I mean, I think, so kind of wrapping up, I think it was interesting when I did a meetup on this, we were kind of at the end talking about what people took away from it. And I think the big takeaways for most people that I spoke to, and it sounds like it was the case in yours, is just a new kind of way of looking at the world, a new, I guess a new paradigm. And maybe that's stronger than any one practical, tangible thing he can kind of throw on at the end. Is that more or less what you've kind of taken away from it?
Yeah, it's sort of hard now to separate because it's become so integrated in so many of my own personal views and frameworks. But I think for me, I think the first time around, it sort of did two things. One, it sort of provided a genealogical explanation and critique of why presumptions we take to be true might not necessarily have to be the case. We might not necessarily have to believe that humans are inherently selfish. And I think I had just read a bunch of books on social psychology and this idea that like we may have, in fact, overestimated how selfish people are and that people are much more social and need social connection and social relationships. And then in addition, providing this, okay, not only why do we believe what we believe and where did we get it from, but what's the alternative?
Well, awesome. I think that's a good place to end it. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I love this book.
Awesome.